Get them gains, bro.
And no, that protein bag is not for getting all muscled up, getting beefcaked, whatever. That's just because there are mornings, and there are quite a lot of mornings, when I just can't eat. Just thinking about eating something makes me feel sick. So that's for those mornings. You have something to get into your system, so you don't have to go with kind of an empty blood. So yesterday I showed this case. So let's see what's in here. We have this. And this was my bay for 3 years, 2000-2003. This is a Minolta 404 SI Dynax. And I used this camera when I was studying visual arts. Main thing I was studying was photography, but also film editing. And when I say film editing, I'm not talking about computers. I'm not talking about clicking a mouse. I'm talking about editing actual moving film. Which was a bit of a hassle, because if you've ever seen or if you ever tried to edit actual analog film, that's kind of fun, you know, all the cutting surfaces, razors, that thin goddamn tape. And with my neurological disabilities, it was a nightmare to learn at first. So I don't even know how many pictures I've taken with this camera. And obviously nowadays this thing is obsolete, because trying to find some good quality film, no. But we were using, or I was using, black and white film. So I took an empty film case and then loaded 21 frames of black and white film into that case. And I used to load 24 just to be sure, because obviously when we're talking about analog photography, no digital but actual film, if you mess it up, you've messed it. It's gone. The moment's gone. Obviously there are some things you can do when you're developing the actual photo. You can manipulate some things in it, but it's not that easy as it is with obviously digital. So if the exposure is a bit off, you can fix it in Photoshop. And when I was an art student, we had an early version of Photoshop that we could use, but I never used it because I wanted to learn how to do things the old-fashioned way. And we had it, and same thing with digital cameras. There were some digital cameras like this around, but the sales of those were not so good, and they were kind of this just upcoming thing. Obviously it was, what, 19 years ago. It was an upcoming thing, and they cost a small fortune. If you wanted to buy a big boy camera, a digital one, it cost a fortune. So I learned how to do things the old-fashioned way, and my portfolio was, I think I still have it somewhere, but it was kind of a let's say mixed bag, but it was kind of a bipolar mixed bag. Half of it was raw documenting. So I was trying to use a camera like we use eyes. So it's just about capturing the moment without staging, without preparing anything. Just capture the moment when it comes. And obviously that's one thing with analog thing. You only have a certain amount of frames that you can take, certain amount of pictures you can take. So you can just take click, 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 but that gets a bit expensive, whereas with digital things you can just snap pictures and then choose the right one. But with analog gear you have to be more aware what you're seeing, what's happening, and you have to be able to kind of predict what could happen and be ready to capture it. So one part was this kind of a raw document, and then the other part was kind of what I would call psychedelic horror. So one thing I liked to do was to take two negatives, put them on top of one another, and then exposure the film paper through that. And that was Photoshop before Photoshop. And that was actually fun to do, kind of be the mad scientist in the dark room, and I liked it. But nowadays you don't really, there's not much use for something like this. There really isn't, because film is hard to find, and I don't have a dark room that I could use. I know there are dark rooms in this area, or not too far from here, but still all the costs, all the chemicals, films, papers, I don't really have the money to do that. And one thing, I don't have the time to do that, but this was the thing back then. And when I bought this wasn't the best camera around at the time, not even close. But this was close enough. This was the one I had the money for. And one thing with this camera is that this is full electric. So if you use a kind of a more robust, and it is plastic. If you use a more robust or more big camera, if the battery runs out, the exposure meter or the lighting meter and flash doesn't work. If this thing runs out of battery, nothing works. It doesn't work at all. But I went with my old mantra: don't try to get the gear you would like to have. Learn how to use the gear you have. So there was a time when I knew this camera like palm of my hand. All the features and what this can do. I pretty much knew everything that you could do with this camera, I'd like to say, at least. And I really miss the analog days. You know, developing negatives and making photos in a dark room, or editing film, a moving film, and all the things you can do with analog. It's, well, nowadays it's easier with computers, but that's something you're not doing with your hands. I mean, you're just doing it with one finger and a mouse. Or two fingers and a mouse and a keyboard. But when you're doing things the old-fashioned way, there is this certain atmosphere of kind of craftsmanship, if that's the right word. You have to know what you're doing, and you only have one shot. If you mess up, for example, if you're editing, let's say 9mm film, moving film, movie film, however you want to put it. If you mess up an edit, there is an undo button, but the analog undo button is, let's just say that I learned the hard way how to get one step back from where you were. Because obviously it involves cutting the film again, inserting the right bit, and then if it's this, then it's like let's say 4 or 6 frames that you've messed up. Not fun. Not fun at all. And obviously if you're not taping the bits together correctly, it doesn't even run through the projector. And but that was, as an experience, it was good. And I never, even when I started studying, I never wanted to be a photographer necessarily. It was kind of a small dream of mine to be a professional photographer. But the more I learned, the more clearer I realized that the way I want to do things, that's not a financially profitable, because I was the art guy of the class, so to speak. And my photos were... there were teachers who understood and appreciated what I did, but then there were few teachers who were like, what? Can you be a bit more conventional, please? Nope. I think I even have some negatives. I have this kind of case with negatives, but I don't think those negatives are even in usable shape anymore. That's also one thing with analog media. If you have negatives and you're not preserving them just right, they're not usable for too long. Obviously, if you're not using professional methods. And since nothing is digitized, what I did, I only have the those big photos that I did, so I can't really go back. I didn't have the means to digitize the negatives, sadly. But it was fun. It was really fun thing to do. And you might be asking, well, why am I not why don't I take photos anymore? Is that because I don't own a digital big boy camera like that? I would like to have a digital camera with the same quality than what this is. Just a cheap, basic camera with a bigger thing. But I don't know, it just... Well, if you have learned to do something the analog way, and then you would have to move to digital, it feels that part of the process is missing. Because the thing I love the most, there were two things. First, capturing that perfect moment, knowing it, that you nailed it. That was one thing. And the second thing was actually, well, for me the true magic happens in the dark room. And now when you don't have a dark room, you only have goddamn screen, keyboard and a mouse. It's not fun anymore. As I said, that certain aspect of hand craftsmanship is lost. And I don't like doing, or I don't like editing photos using a computer. It's just not fun for me. The mad scientist aspect is missing, and that was the thing I loved the most. And when I was going through this bag, I actually found a, for some reason, because I didn't even usually use this, but there's still one unopened roll of film. This 24 frames, 400 ISO, and this was the fun part. Developed before January 2011. So this film is gone, and I don't even know why it is here, because I didn't use this brand of film. I very rarely even used color film. Most of the time, and this was also one thing that was kind of exceptional, because most students used just a regular black and white film. But I used this a certain brand of black and white film, and you use in order to develop that film to negatives, you use the same process that you use when you're developing color film. So by nature that film wasn't smooth in a way that regular black and white film is smooth. If you look at the image, there was this certain graininess to it that I liked. Kind of a, I don't know the English word for it, raster, I think is close enough word so you can understand what I'm saying. And one thing also was that I never owned a tripod. That was also one thing that people kind of asked me, well, why not? Because I wanted to use a camera like eyes. And your eyes are constantly moving, your head is constantly moving. So I wanted to create that same atmosphere with a camera. So if you use a tripod, yes, you can use longer exposure times and so forth. But the documentative aspect suffered, in my opinion, and I hope that was the right word. But it suffered if your camera is on a tripod. Then it's steady, it's static, and I never liked filming that way, or taking pictures that way. I wanted to give this kind of a impression of movement, not by actually moving the camera, but still without using a tripod. You're not stationary, you can turn around, you can move, and I wanted to take photos that way. And obviously I had to use tripods when I was doing some, let's say, studio shoots. That's when tripods were kind of necessary, because you're using the remote control for the camera. And but I never liked studio. This is kind of hard to say, but it may sound a bit odd, but I never liked being in a controlled environment. And that's kind of the opposite what comes to music. I mean, if I could be in a studio 24/7 what comes to music, I would love the hell out of it. But playing live 24/7, that would be well, I do like playing live, but I don't get that much kicks from playing live than what I get when in the studio, because that's the mad scientist part. You can do anything as long as you have the CPU power for it. So you can do anything in the studio when it comes to audio. And that's the same thing with being in a dark room. When dabbling with photos, you can do anything. Or, well, possibilities are not unlimited, but they're pretty far out there. And I also noticed that I don't have my small notebook here. I used to write down notes for every frame I took, where I wrote down the film I was using, the exposure I was using, the zoom level I was using, pretty much everything I documented. So then when I had the finished photo, I was able to write that same info to the behind of the photo. So if someone asked me what I used, you can just turn the photo around and there were all the info. What hole I was using, what film I was using, how long of an exposure I was using, and all of that zoom level and all of those stuffs. And that camera doesn't have all that much zoom. I think this goes from 80 to 28. So not all that much what comes to macro and zoom out. But this camera forced me to go close, which was again something I liked. It was much more of a hands-on feel. When you can't take a photo from this far away, you had to go in close. You had to be kind of it was a intimate relationship with your target, if you can put it that way. And I like that. And it's kind of the same feel that I get with an acoustic guitar. If we like to draw some lines between music and photography. It's the same thing with acoustic guitar. It's something that's close. I do love the taking an electric and crank it up, but then I'm usually being shouted at because I'm too loud. Well, one good thing with photography, you can't be too loud. Well, obviously, if you're doing a this kind of a freelance thing, or you're hired to take pictures, so let's say you're in a funeral, well then obviously you need a longer tube, because it's not polite that people are grieving and you're among them snapping. So that's not a good thing. You want to keep this kind of a polite distance. Weddings are a bit different thing, because often the overall atmosphere, what comes to weddings, you can be among people and you can actually be very close to the target. But for example, funerals, you want to keep that polite distance, and you also have to be prepared with the right gear, so you can take those close-ups even if you are far away. But and this, by the way, this is the only objective I have, or whatever this is in English. This is the only thing I have, and that again goes along with the thing that I didn't want it to replace something. I wanted to learn how to use what I had as effectively as possible. And this was it. It wasn't the best camera, but it was my camera. If this all of a sudden cuts off, it's because it's -17 here. But continuing the analog digital thing, yesterday I watched a review of a first generation Line 6 pod. Link down below if you're interested. And I remember when those things first came out, quite a few people liked them because of their convenience sake. It was a small desktop unit with all kinds of different sounds in it and effects, and it wasn't complicated to use. I remember trying out one of those, and it was easy to use, or it was intuitive to use. And people liked the tones that they were getting, what came to home recording back then, doing shows with a decent PA, because obviously you need in-ear monitors or a decent floor monitors, because obviously you don't have an amp roaring behind you. And people liked them, people used them. Some people had these, well, it was an accessory, but you could buy a small floorboard that had, I think it had 2 switches and an expression pedal. If I'm not wrong, you could connect that to first generation pod. So it was something convenient to have for jamming, just for playing on your own, or doing small shows with a good PA, or with a decent PA, for example. And I agree with the thing that was said in that review, that if you want to use those kind of more high gain, more heavier amp models, you have to really use an external overdrive pedal. I mean, I've done the same thing with the XV amp I have, or I've showed it in the video at least once or twice. If you want to use, there's an Engel amp in that thing, then there's Soldano, and I think the one is Mesa Boogie rectifier. And if you want to use those, and now I'm talking about the XV amp, you have to use some kind of an overdrive before the effects unit itself, and I'm using TS9 Tube Screamer, the first pedal I ever bought back in 1997, I think it was. And I still have it, the mean green box, the Swiss knife of tone shaping, if you can say it. But nowadays people are going like, oh, digital. So there are kind of 2 camps. Obviously there are a lot of people who fall kind of between, but there are 2 camps. There are those guys who are using something like Helix or Axe Effects or something like that, and they don't have any problem with it, simply because it's convenient. But then there are those guys who are saying, no, tube power only. They're only using tube amps and all that because that's true. I'm like, come on, are we black metalers from early 90s or what? Well, obviously if you want to be a sonic hipster, then go for it, and if that's your thing, if you like tube amps, well, so do I. But the reason I'm using solid state amps, and I've always used solid state amps, is that with tube amp you win something what comes to tone and tone control, but you lose also quite a bit what comes to reliability and ruggedness. So that's why I've always used solid state. The less things to go wrong, less things that can go wrong. But if you think about it, if you're just playing few shows here and there, some bars, small clubs, well, you can take a tube amp with you, because that's not a problem if you're only playing every now and then live. Just take your amp there, although if you have a 100-watt dual rectifier and you're playing in a small club, you have a wrong kind of amp, unless you have a load box or something like that, because 100-watt amp, tube amp in a small club, that to my ears and to my thoughts, that doesn't really sound all that good because you can't crank it. But if you are in a band that's constantly on the road, there's no reason, in my opinion, to lug all those tube amps around. Just use something like Helix or Axe Effects. That does the job. And if you're playing live, there are some people who are going, nah, they're not using real amps. But it's pretty sure to say that most of the audience don't care what you're using, because they want to see you, they want to hear those songs. So it's not about gear. And some of it is about player feel. Obviously, if you're playing with an actual amp and you can crank it, you can feel the sound. You can actually physically feel it rumbling through you. But if you're using this amp modelers and modeling technology, if you have in-ears, it feels like listening to a really bad MP3 player, in my opinion. But again, it's more controlled environment. I mean, it's easy to mix, it's easy to produce that whole show when there are no amps roaring on stage. And what comes to roading and traveling, it's convenient. You don't need a big arsenal of amps. Obviously there are bands who are doing that even to this day, but I don't really think that most of those cabs are loaded. I think they're just there for the show, so you can have that wall of Marshall cabinets, most of them empty. But still, and amp modelers are a nice thing to have. And you can always boost them and manipulate them with external gear. So if you have something like, let's say, pod, it does something that you like, but it lacks on some areas. Well, you can always use your own pedals if you have outboard pedals and that kind of stuff. You can always kind of enhance it. And you still have less things to carry around than if you would do a show with cab, amp head, and a big pedal board. It's just convenient. But then there are those guys who are saying that's not true. It's not true. It's not the sound. We're losing the sound, master. But who cares? The gear doesn't make you a good musician. It's the songs. And that's something people seem to forget these days. If you don't have good songs, you'll impress people with huge sound. But if there are no actual songs to frame that sound, or actually those sounds are framing the song, and if there is no picture inside of those frames, well, nice frame, but where's the thing? Okay, someone's been feeding these, because when I showed up, they showed up. But sorry guys, I don't have any bread for you. Sorry! Hardware store for sale. Children's clothing and appliances or accessories closed, for sale, for rent. And this is what's happening all over the country, and I think it's pretty safe to say that it's happening all over the Western world. Small shops are closing down, and all that's left are those big shopping centers, big malls that have no soul, no spirit, where people are spending money they don't have to buy things they don't really need. Yay! Keep on rocking in a free world. Well, if you have the money for it, that is.
Girl is back home a bit earlier than we expected, but my mom's having some kind of a stomach bug. She was throwing up all night last night, so I really hope that we don't get it. But I've been watching a video from a channel called Old Style Gaming, and the name of this video is the 74 best Commodore 64 games ever. And it's kind of weird to see a childhood flashing by, because so far I'm almost at the end, and there have been only few games I've never played on Commodore 64, and those games have been one or two sports games and then some side-scrolling sci-fi like spaceship shooting games like R-Type or something like that. Or what was the name of one game? Gradius, I think. So that style of games I've never played, but really, let's be honest, if you've played few games like that, you've pretty much played them all, because the only thing that changes is the graphics, but mainly it's the same thing. Before I watched this, I watched a video called was it the most successful or the best Commodore 64 arcade ports? So they were arcade games that were ported to Commodore 64. And on that list there were again only few games that I've never played. So I would like to get back into kind of an old school gaming. This is again one of those it would be nice if, because there are a few Commodore 64s on my parents' attic, but I don't remember if none of them actually work. But it was nice. I mean, it was the time of the joystick, and I would really like to get back into joystick gaming, but not with these kind of what are they called? Battle sticks, fighting sticks that people are using when playing fighting games. No, just the real old school joystick with let's see. Well, usually those joysticks that I've used, there were 4 buttons, so 2 on the handle and 2 on the base of the joystick. And I remember that the problem with those things was that they had these suction cups in the bottom that were never secured. They always came off. And finally I remember tearing the top part, or the actual joystick part, off from one of the joysticks because I was so damn frustrated. I think it was Pit Stop 2. And I never managed to do a pit stop in time. So I was like, whoops. But it still worked, because there were those 2 buttons on the base, 2 fire buttons on the base of the joystick. But that was weird to play with. And it's also kind of, well, somewhat natural, at the same time weird, that I started console gaming when I was a kid with an NES. And that controller still feels natural for me to hold. But then from that to Super Nintendo controller, okay, a bit more buttons. And I remember the first time I ever saw an Xbox controller. Like, what's that? Although PlayStation controllers I was familiar with, and there are quite a few buttons on that too. But for some reason, first generation Xbox controller, and now I'm talking about the fat one, that was, what's that? And when it comes to PlayStation controllers, I always liked the fatty. I always liked that fat controller, the big controller. There are people who have said that no, the only real controller is the slim one. But I don't know. Same thing with current day Xbox controllers or console controllers in general. I like bigger controllers. Well, obviously because my hands are not all that small, so it's just better grip. You actually feel that you're holding something. But comparing that to NES controller, that's also not all that big, but still it feels comfortable, maybe because there is only the D-pad and 2 buttons, A and B. But what comes to now modern controllers, I want a big controller. Just feels better to play. And what comes to games in general, I really miss Twisted Metal 1 and 2. I probably should bust out the old PlayStation sometimes. I still have a PlayStation that my brother bought years ago, and then he gave it to me when he was upgrading his own consoles. So he gave me the old console, and that's also why I have the first generation Xbox. He gave it to me when he got, was the Xbox 360, I think. So he gave me the old one. And one thing is that I've been thinking about for a while. I should get a capture card that allows me to stream Xbox games, because it would be nice to play console games or stream console games for a change. But all I have is the AverMedia Live Gamer Portable as my capture card, and it works fine when you're using it with the control. When you're using it with between 2 PCs, it works fine. But I would have to find a way to get the video signal into HDMI and the audio signal to the line in of that AverMedia through a mixer. So I would have to get some adapters. But again, that's one of those it would be nice if things. Pasta, cream, minced beef. And down she goes. Dessert. And yes, I'm using the same plate, but it's my turn to do the dishes. 10 p.m. bedtime. Last night was quite rough, and I can feel it. So I think today is done. After eating, I tried to go for an evening walk, but it was quite short walk. Trees were banging and cracking because it's so cold. And tomorrow it should be something like -25, -24. So I don't think I'm going to film all that much outdoors. Because already, actually, my phone died. When I was out walking today, my phone was in my pocket, in my winter coat pocket. I never used it. I didn't took it off from there. When I got home, it was dead. So, and completely cold. Although I didn't feel the cold, or it wasn't all that cold for me, because I had, 5 layers of clothes on me. But my phone felt it, obviously. So I think this is cut. Roll the cameras out. Put the actors back into their caravans. See ya.